The Astor Wellington Charity Gala sparkled like a dream stitched in silk and champagne. Held in the opulent crystal hall of the Langford Grand Hotel, it was less about charity and more about performance. Beneath the glittering chandeliers, Manhattan's wealthiest mingled in designer gowns and made-to-measure tuxedos, sipping vintage rosé as if saving the world were a side effect of elegance. Julian Astor stood at the center of it all, effortlessly magnetic. 34, heir to the Astor financial empire, and a perennial fixture on every most desirable list. He was the kind of man headlines adored. Everything about him, his posture, his smile, even the way he held his glass, radiated the quiet arrogance of someone who never had to ask for anything twice. His tuxedo hugged his athletic build like it had been sewn onto him, and a watch that cost more than some apartments gleamed on his wrist. On his arm was Bianca Moreau, heiress to a shipping fortune and fluent in polite disinterest. She leaned in and whispered, "Do you even know what cause this gala's for?" Julian gave a half smile, the kind that flickered but never warmed. "Children, I think, or rainforests. Honestly, it's all the same when April comes around. It's a deduction either way." Not far from him, someone stopped moving. Claire Whitmore stood frozen, the stem of a champagne flute clenched in her hand. Dressed in the black and white catering uniform, she was just another face among the staff, unseen, unacknowledged. But in that moment, his words pierced something tender inside her. 28, and overqualified for temp jobs like this, Claire juggled grad school in environmental law by day and events like these by night. Her mother often asked why she couldn't just find a real job. But Claire believed in causes that didn't pay well, yet mattered more than any paycheck. She stepped forward, heart pounding. "Did you really just say that helping orphans and protecting the planet are interchangeable? Because of tax breaks?" The room didn't fall silent, but it paused just enough for the tension to hum beneath the laughter and clinking glasses. Julian turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry, were you speaking to me?" "I was." Claire set her tray down, her voice calm but clear, "because I wasn't sure someone could actually be that indifferent to human suffering and environmental collapse." A few nearby guests turned to watch. Discomfort, curiosity, entertainment. The usual reactions of people unused to being challenged in their ivory towers. Julian gave a soft chuckle, more amused than offended. "Sweetheart, I wrote a check for $2 million tonight. I doubt the orphans or the trees care if I believe in the cause, so long as the money clears." "My name's not Sweetheart," she replied, stepping closer. "It's Claire, Claire Whitmore. And some things some people should matter beyond how useful they are to your accountant." His gaze sharpened, just slightly. "How do you know my name?" "Everyone knows who you are," she said, chin raised. "The man who has everything, but doesn't value anything he hasn't bought." There it was, that flicker again, something unreadable behind his cool exterior. "I've been watching you all night," she added. "You haven't spoken to a single person this event is supposedly helping. You didn't even bother to learn what the charity is." Julian leaned in, voice low and even. "It's the Whitmore Initiative for Educational Equity. Your father's foundation, if I'm not mistaken." The blood drained from her face. "Curious," he continued, "that his daughter is serving drinks at the benefit instead of hosting it." She didn't respond. She didn't need to. The crack in her composure was brief, but real. He saw it. "I make it my business to know things," he said. And just like that, the moment passed. But something had shifted, an invisible line drawn, A curtain pulled. A man who lived above the world had been called down, and a woman who'd gone unseen had stepped into the light. "Everyone here knows who you are, Miss Whitmore," Julian said, the corners of his mouth curling into a razor-sharp smile. "Even the fallen angels still talk about you. Your father mentioned something about a disagreement over how his money should be spent. Very noble of you, rejecting the trust fund. How's that working out?" That was the moment something inside Claire broke. The sound echoed like a firecracker across the marble floors, the unmistakable, blistering crack of her palm striking his cheek. It was a sound that didn't belong in a room full of polite laughter and clinking glasses. For a split second, the gala froze. Julian's head turned with the force of the slap, and his hand instinctively went to the burning welt rising on his skin. The hush was deafening. Security began moving toward them, but he lifted a hand, halting them with the same authority that built empires. His eyes never left hers. "No one," he said in a low voice, edged with disbelief and danger, "has ever dared." "There's a first time for everything," Claire interrupted, her tone unwavering. She untied her server's apron and tossed it onto a nearby chair. "Consider it a down payment on your education in basic human decency." Then she turned and walked away, shoulders back, chin high. Julian Astor stood motionless, stunned, not just by the sting on his face, but by the woman who delivered it. He didn't know it yet, but somewhere beneath the outrage, something far more inconvenient had begun to stir curiosity. Neither of them could have imagined that exactly 3 months from that night, they'd be standing side by side at an altar, bound not by love, but by a contract neither wanted and neither could escape. The first domino had fallen, and the universe was just beginning its cruel little joke. Julian Astor sat alone in his father's private study, a place where mahogany and power hung heavier than the scent of aged scotch. 3 weeks had passed since the gala, but the sting lingered on his pride more than his skin. The slap had gone viral. "Billionaire gets reality check," the headlines read, as the video exploded across social media with millions of views and gleeful commentary. Across the room, Harold Astor stood with the posture of a man who had outlasted wars, recessions, and political upheaval, yet somehow his son's public embarrassment was harder to stomach. "You've really outdone yourself this time," Harold said, voice carved from stone. "Our stock dropped 4 points after that circus." "I didn't stage a scene," Julian muttered. "She hit me. After you insulted her, her father, and the very idea of charity." A cool voice chimed in from the corner. Victoria Astor didn't even glance up from her phone. At 32, she had the mind of a chess master and the patience of someone who knew she could outmaneuver everyone in the room. If Harold Astor hadn't been so set on legacy by son, she would have been running the company already. "I've watched the video 42 times, she added. "It gets better every time." Julian scowled at her. "Don't you have a company to run?" "I'm multitasking," she replied sweetly. "Someone in this family has to." Harold slammed his palm onto the desk, the sound slicing the air. "Enough. This isn't about your sibling rivalry. This is about the future of Astor Holdings." He turned his full attention to Julian. The room fell heavy with expectation. "The board is starting to question whether you're fit to take over." The words landed with brutal precision. "That's ridiculous," Julian said, but the protest lacked the fire he needed. "It's not just the video," Harold continued. "It's the pattern, the arrogance, the detachment, The board and I need proof that you're capable of leading with maturity, that you understand what legacy means." Julian reached for his glass and finished the scotch in a single swallow. "So what? You want me to write a public apology to the angry waitress?" Victoria snorted. "She's hardly a waitress." Julian looked up. "Claire Whitmore graduated summa cum laude from Yale Law," she said, tapping her phone. "She works with 3 international environmental justice coalitions and turned down a 6-figure offer at Morrison & Klein to stay in advocacy." She paused, looking at him over the edge of her screen. "Oh, and her father, Richard Whitmore? He has influence over nearly a third of the Southeast Asian market, the very one we've been trying to expand into." Julian stared at her, stunned. "How the hell do you know all this?" "Because unlike you," she said, slipping her phone into her purse, "I come prepared to meetings." Victoria finally lifted her gaze from her phone, her tone almost amused. "Dad didn't drag us here for fun." Harold nodded and opened a sleek leather folder, sliding it across the desk toward his son. "I've been speaking with Richard Whitmore for years now. Our companies have been eyeing opposite horizons. He's looking to expand westward. We're pushing east. Strategically, we're a perfect fit." Julian flipped the folder open. It didn't take more than a glance to realize what it was: merger documents, prepped and polished. "So close the deal," he said with a shrug, barely hiding his boredom. "What's that got to do with me?" Harold and Victoria exchanged a glance that made his stomach twist. "There are conditions," Harold said, his voice slow, deliberate. "The incident with his daughter created an unexpected opportunity." Julian straightened, suddenly alert. "What kind of opportunity?" Harold leaned in, eyes sharp. "The Whitmore family is steeped in tradition. Richard is deeply concerned about Claire's future. She's brilliant, yes, but idealistic. He worries she'll spend her life chasing unprofitable dreams." Julian's throat tightened. He didn't like where this was going. "I still don't see how that involves me," he said, though a sense of unease had already begun to settle in his chest. "It's simple," Harold replied, clasping his hands. "You're going to marry Claire Whitmore." The silence that followed hit like a thunderclap. Julian let out a short, incredulous laugh. "You can't be serious." Harold didn't blink. "Completely serious. The prenuptial agreement is in the folder, page 4. The marriage would need to last at least 1 year to meet the terms both families have agreed to." Julian stared at him, stunned. "You want me to marry the woman who slapped me in front of 1,000 people?" "She humiliated you, yes," Harold said evenly. "And now you'll return the favor by repairing your public image while securing access to a market that would otherwise take us 20 years to crack." "And what about Claire?" Julian asked, his voice low. "Somehow, I doubt she's thrilled at the idea either." "Richard is handling that conversation as we speak," Harold replied, with the kind of calm that made Julian feel even worse. "He has his own methods." Across the East River, in a modest walk-up apartment in Brooklyn, Claire Whitmore was pacing furiously. "This is insane," she said, her voice rising with disbelief. "You can't just arrange a marriage like this. I'm not a character in some Victorian novel." Her father sat calmly on her second-hand sofa, still impeccably dressed despite the late hour, his expression as unreadable as always. "It's not just a business deal, Claire," he said, as though he were offering her a gift, not a cage. "It's a turning point. With the Astor partnership, we could implement the exact sustainability programs you've been fighting for." Claire stopped mid-step, What are you talking about? Harold Astor has agreed to adopt your environmental compliance proposals as part of the merger, her father replied, the faintest hint of pride in his voice. Every investment in their portfolio over $200 billion would be subject to the standards you outlined in your thesis. She sat down, stunned. Why would he agree to that? Because his son embarrassed you in front of the entire elite, her father answered. And because I made it a non-negotiable term, just as the marriage is my non-negotiable to him. Claire looked at him like she no longer recognized the man in front of her. You can't honestly expect me to marry Julian Astor for a year to close a deal. You need to see this for what it is, he said quietly. A business agreement with unprecedented humanitarian upside. She shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. And if I say no? Her father's expression shifted. Not angry, just cold. Then I'll withdraw all funding from the Whitmore Foundation and its 74 global initiatives. That includes the Clean Water Project in Malaysia and the education program for girls in Afghanistan. The words hit harder than any slap ever could. That's not persuasion, she whispered. That's emotional blackmail. No, he corrected gently. That's leverage. He looked at her, not unkindly. I've given you the freedom to chase your ideals, Claire. Now, I'm asking you to make a choice for something bigger than yourself. 1 year. A single year of pragmatic surrender. At the Astor estate, Julian stood at the edge of his father's study, absorbing the final blow of a negotiation he never agreed to begin. If you refuse, Harold was saying, his voice quiet but resolute, I'll have no choice but to reconsider the company's succession plan. Victoria has already proven she has the judgment and the discipline. Across the room, Victoria shifted in her seat, clearly uneasy at being used as leverage. For what it's worth, she said, I think the entire plan is medieval and slightly deranged. But the logic is solid. Julian said nothing. He turned toward the towering windows that framed the city like a painting, Central Park glittering below. The skyline blurred as he tried to picture any version of this where he came out intact. 1 year, he asked at last, not turning around. 365 days, Harold confirmed. You'll present the image of a committed husband. After that, a quiet, clean divorce with generous terms for Miss Whitmore. And she's agreed to this circus? Richard can be persuasive, Harold said simply. Almost on cue, Harold's phone vibrated. He checked the screen, and a rare, satisfied smile appeared on his face. We have confirmation. The wedding is scheduled for next month, he announced. A small ceremony at the Hamptons estate, private, but with a public statement. It'll make waves. Julian remained by the window, his reflection staring back at him with a mixture of exhaustion and accusation. Somewhere out there, Claire was likely pacing her own cage, doing the same calculations, weighing the same impossible cost. He exhaled, shoulders heavy. Fine, he said, voice hollow. 1 year, not a day more. Neither he nor Claire heard the quiet exchange that followed, as Harold ended the call and shared a glance with Victoria. It was the kind of look only fathers who'd played the long game could share, calculated, patient, smug. They'll thank us one day, Harold murmured. Victoria arched an eyebrow. I'd actually pay to see that. The Astor estate in the Hamptons had long since become a monument to generational wealth, columned, sprawling, and revered by architecture magazines as much as by gossip columns. On this day, It wore the soft elegance of a modern fairy tale: white florals, tailored linens, subtle gold details, the kind of wedding even Whitmorgers might envy. And in a quiet guest suite on the east wing, Claire Whitmore stood before a floor-length mirror, barely recognizing the woman staring back. The gown, Vera Wang, hand-stitched, fit like a whispered secret. Soft lace clung to her frame, beading catching the light like dew. It was a dress made for a bride in love, not for a woman being traded. "You look beautiful," came her mother's voice from the doorway. Margaret Whitmore had always been the softer contrast to Richard's sharp ambition. Where he dealt in deals and vision, she offered warmth, and now, worry. "Are you sure about this?" Margaret asked gently. Claire adjusted her diamond earrings gifts from her soon-to-be husband, delivered that morning with a handwritten card. Just a single letter signed at the bottom. J. "I'm sure about the agreement," she said. "The environmental reforms in this deal could accelerate climate efforts by decades. It's not a wedding. It's a leverage point." Margaret stepped into the room, placing a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "Marriage shouldn't be a sacrifice, Claire, even a temporary one." Claire smiled softly, sadness flickering behind her eyes. "You and Dad had an arranged marriage," she reminded her. "That was different," Margaret replied quickly. "We met several times. There was no animosity." "You mean I hadn't slapped him in front of half the city?" The corners of Claire's mouth lifted into a half laugh, but Margaret didn't return the smile. Her eyes were still clouded with concern. "I worry he'll be cruel to you." That stopped Claire. She looked at her mother, really looked, and let the moment settle before replying. "I can handle Julian Astor," she said quietly. "From what I've seen, he's more bark than bite." But neither of them could shake the feeling that once the veil was lifted, this wedding would be far more than either of them had bargained for. "She's not marrying him for love, Mom," Claire said softly, squeezing her mother's hands. "It's for optics. We'll live in the same penthouse, attend the same events, and otherwise lead separate lives. The contract spells it out." Margaret nodded, but her eyes didn't soften. "Just remember, Konyu, hearts don't always follow what's written in contracts." Across the estate, in a private room near the main house, Julian Astor's preparation was a stark contrast. No quiet moments, no soft warnings. Just dry champagne, a mirror, and his oldest friend helping him into a life he hadn't chosen. "I still can't believe you're actually going through with this," said Daniel Rodriguez, his best man and a hedge fund manager, with opinions he rarely kept to himself. He tugged Julian's bow tie into place with a sigh. "The Julian Astor I know would have told his father to take the whole empire and shove it into offshore retirement." Julian adjusted his platinum cufflinks, his expression unreadable. "The Julian Astor you know enjoys private jets and vintage Bordeaux. Starting over isn't really my brand." "So you're marrying a woman who loathes you just to keep your inheritance?" Daniel said, eyebrows raised. "That's bleak, even for you." "She doesn't loathe me," Julian replied automatically, then paused. "Okay, she probably does. But it's mutual. And temporary." He checked his watch, different from the one he wore at the gala, but no less extravagant. 12 months of marital performance. She gets funding for her environmental crusade. And I get to keep living disgustingly well. Everyone wins. Daniel studied his face, his usual sarcasm replaced by something closer to concern. "And you're not at all bothered that your father basically strong-armed you into this? Or that he thinks Victoria's the better choice to run the company?" Julian's jaw tightened slightly. She probably is, he muttered, but that's not the point. Then what is the point? He didn't get the chance to answer. A knock at the door interrupted them, and Victoria swept in without waiting. She was elegance in motion, wrapped in a dusky rose dress that matched the seaside palette perfectly. She'd agreed to be maid of honor, not out of sentiment, but to preserve the illusion of a happy, unified family. "It's showtime, little brother," she announced. "Your blushing bride awaits, though any blush will probably be rage-induced." "Your support is touching," Julian replied, dry as ever. Victoria hesitated, then softened just slightly. "For what it's worth," she said, stepping closer, "I told Dad this whole thing was borderline sociopathic, but since you're going through with it..." She handed him a small velvet box. "Here." Julian opened it and stared. Inside lay an emerald and diamond ring, one he hadn't seen in years, but remembered vividly. Their grandmother's ring, the only family member who had ever treated him with warmth instead of strategy. "Why are you giving me this?" he asked, confused. "The wedding planner already has the rings." "This one's not for the ceremony," Victoria said quietly. "It's for after, for appearances. Grandmother left it specifically for your future wife. Dad thinks using it will make the marriage seem more authentic." Julian looked at the ring for a long moment. The memory of his grandmother, the only softness in a house full of power plays, washed over him like a tide. She would be appalled by this. "Perfect," he muttered, snapping the box shut. "Wouldn't want our fake marriage to feel inauthentic." 40 minutes later, Julian stood at the altar overlooking the endless sweep of the Atlantic. The September wind carried a faint chill, rustling the white blossoms tied to the wooden arch behind him. 60 guests filled the chairs, every one of them selected, vetted, and seated with intent. Security had been doubled, drones were spotted, and paparazzi had camped out along the cliffs since dawn. The society wedding of the season was underway. The string quartet shifted its tune, and every head turned. Julian looked up and froze. There she was. Claire Whitmore stepped into view on her father's arm, and for a breath the world narrowed. He had expected her to look beautiful. She was, objectively, beautiful. But this was different. The dress, soft lace, effortless movement hugged her, like it knew her better than anyone else ever had. Her eyes, steady and unreadable, held his across the distance with quiet fire. Julian Astor forgot what he was supposed to do next. And that terrified him more than anything else. Even when Claire had cut him down with that blistering honesty at the gala, Julian had admired her fire. But now, as she walked toward him, lace brushing her heels, eyes fixed forward, there was something in her expression that caught him completely off guard. She didn't look afraid. She didn't even look angry. She looked resolute. Not a woman being led to sacrifice, but a soldier walking into battle. Their eyes met, and something passed between them. Quiet, mutual, a flicker of recognition that they were both unwilling participants in the same performance, and that perhaps, if nothing else, they would walk through it with dignity. When her father placed her hand into Julian's, he expected nothing. But there it was, an undeniable spark. Barely a second, just a shift in the air, but enough that even Claire blinked. Her expression faltered for the briefest moment before she reset it, her poise slipping back into place like a well-worn mask. "Fancy meeting you here," Julian whispered, unable to resist. "Try not to look like you're attending your own funeral," she murmured back, through a strained smile. Your stock might dip another point. The officiant, a retired judge and longtime Astor family friend, began the ceremony with smooth solemnity, spinning corporate strategy into the language of union and shared vision. One could almost believe this arrangement was noble. When it came time for vows, they stuck strictly to the script, elegant, traditional, and utterly impersonal. No improvisation, no tenderness, just enough humanity to satisfy the audience. I now pronounce you husband and wife, the judge concluded. You may kiss the bride. A pause. They hadn't choreographed this part. It had been mentioned, vaguely, during legal reviews, appearance optional, no requirement of affection. But in that suspended silence, with 60 influential witnesses watching, and a dozen cameras hidden behind floral arrangements, Julian leaned in slowly, giving her every opportunity to dodge. She didn't. Instead, Claire closed the distance, meeting him halfway. Their lips touched. It should have been brief, polite, perfunctory. A kiss for optics. But it wasn't. It lingered. Just long enough to blur the line between contract and curiosity. Just long enough to surprise them both. When they pulled apart, their expressions were composed, but the disorientation lingered beneath the surface. They turned to face the guests, applause rising around them like waves crashing onto rocks. Well, Claire whispered as she tightened her grip on his arm, that was unexpected. Julian didn't look at her. It won't happen again. Gladly, she said. But her voice had a Whitmore softness to it, something that didn't quite match the words. The reception was a masterclass in carefully curated illusion. They danced their first dance to Ella Fitzgerald's At Last, each movement fluid and graceful, the product of decades of social conditioning. They cut the cake, accepted congratulations, and smiled like people in love. Their timing, their expressions, their whispered laughter, it was all impeccable, Oscar-worthy. Only when they slipped away for a romantic moment on the stone terrace, a moment choreographed for photo ops, but seized for air, did the facade crack, just a little. One down, Julian muttered, loosening his bow tie as he leaned against the balustrade. 364 to go. Claire sighed, slipping off her heels with a groan of relief. Actually, the contract specifies 365 days from today. So technically, still 365. You lawyers and your precision, he said, snagging 2 glasses of champagne from a passing server. He handed her one without looking, and she accepted it. She studied him for a moment over the rim of her glass, then turned toward the ocean, where the sun was beginning to dissolve into the waves, casting gold and crimson across the horizon. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "We're married now," he replied, half smiling. "I think that grants you the privilege." "Why did you agree to this?" she asked quietly. "Really?" He didn't answer right away. The wind played with her hair as she stood beside him, eyes on the water. She could have hated him. Maybe she still did. But there was no venom in her question. Only curiosity. And something softer. Sadder. "You could have walked away," she added. "Told your father no. Found some other way to keep your crown." Julian thought about deflecting. Thought about spinning some clever, sarcastic line the way he always did. But he didn't. He looked at her, and for once, he let the mask slip. Julian didn't dodge the question. He answered it quietly, honestly. "For the same reason you did, I suspect. The path of least resistance." He paused, then added, "And maybe a small flicker of guilt about the gala." Claire tilted her head, studying him. You feel guilty about that night? Not about what I said, Julian clarified. About how little I bothered to know. I dismissed you without a second thought. That was sloppy and unfair. She blinked, visibly surprised. Then to his own surprise, she laughed. It was real, not rehearsed or polite, but a light, genuine sound that melted the edge off the moment. That might be the worst apology I've ever heard. Julian found himself smiling. I'm out of practice. Haven't had to apologize to anyone in years. Well, she said, finishing her champagne, you've got 365 days to improve. She turned toward the glass doors leading back into the reception. We should rejoin the party. Our loving families will think we've eloped again. As they walked side by side, Julian's hand brushed hers accidentally. The contact was fleeting, unintentional, but just as electric as their kiss. Neither acknowledged it, just as neither acknowledged the subtle glances traded across the ballroom between their fathers, between Victoria's quiet concern or Margaret Whitmore's watchful gaze, filled with something dangerously close to understanding. For now, the illusion held. But tomorrow, the performance would end, and the real challenge would begin. This isn't going to work. Claire stood in the center of Julian Astor's penthouse, their penthouse now, legally speaking, and scanned the space with a frown that deepened by the second. Sleek, expensive, effortlessly curated. Every surface gleamed with either chrome, glass, or some endangered hardwood. The kind of place that belonged in a design magazine. Stunning, yes, but it had no soul. What exactly isn't going to work? Julian asked as he loosened his tie, pouring himself a drink from a marble-wrapped bar that retracted into the wall. His voice was as casual as ever, but there was a flicker of fatigue in his eyes. My toothbrush, your closet, the single bedroom, this entire arrangement. They had returned that morning from a carefully orchestrated honeymoon in the Hamptons, a weekend spent in opposite wings of the estate, while their PR teams spun it into something dreamy. Now, Claire was facing the reality of their year-long performance, and the setting felt less like home and more like a very expensive stage. Julian took a slow sip of scotch. I assumed everything was clear. We live under the same roof. We make appearances when needed. The contract doesn't say anything about sleeping arrangements, if that's what this is about. My concern, Claire said, arms crossed, is that your apartment has one bedroom. Technically inaccurate, Julian replied smoothly. There's the master suite, my office, and a second guest room I converted into a gym. Feel free to take your pick. How generous, she said flatly, a corner of your bachelor kingdom. Should I be grateful? He gave a tight smile. Would you rather we go apartment hunting together? Start a gift registry? Pick out matching towels? Actually, she snapped, I'd rather we begin with basic human consideration. Julian placed his glass down with deliberate calm. Fine. The office becomes your bedroom. I'll have my assistant move everything out tomorrow. You eat in your office too? No, he said. That's what the dining room is for. You use the dining room? Not traditionally. Then why do you have one? He shrugged, as if the answer were obvious. It came with the apartment. Claire blinked, then laughed. It burst out of her involuntarily half disbelief, half exhaustion. The kind of laugh you let go of when the situation is so absurd, it's either that or scream. You really do live in a different world, don't you? Claire's words weren't cruel, just observant, but something flickered across Julian's face at the remark irritation. maybe, or something heavier, unspoken. We all live in the worlds we choose, he replied, voice cool. Miss Whitmore. He hesitated, then amended. Or should I say, Mrs. Astor? Don't call me that, Claire snapped. The word's automatic, too sharp. It is technically your legal name now, Julian pointed out, maddeningly calm. Unless you'd indicated a preference to keep your maiden name, which would have required discussion prior to filing the certificates. A headache bloomed behind her eyes. She hadn't even thought about her name, had barely caught her breath in the whirlwind of contracts, public appearances, and staged affection. I'll have it changed back, she muttered. As you wish, Julian said, his tone unreadable, though it may chip the illusion of a united front. Before she could fire back, her phone buzzed with a text. She glanced at the screen, then blinked. Your sister wants to know if we're joining the family for dinner tomorrow night at Le Bernardin. Apparently, it's a Blackwood tradition to parade the newlyweds. Julian raised an eyebrow. That's unusually proactive of Victoria. Our quarterly family dinner isn't due until next week. You schedule family dinners? Would you prefer we drop in on each other, unannounced, sitcom style? Claire shook her head. My family eats together every Sunday. No scheduling, no performance, just the understanding that family shows up for family. Something passed over Julian's face, something she couldn't quite read. Amusement, bitterness. How charmingly traditional, he said softly. Well, you've married into a different tradition now, one with calendar invites and separate checks. Claire blinked. You split the bill at family dinners? Julian lifted a shoulder. My father believes it builds financial independence. Let me guess you and Victoria have been paying your own way since you were 16, with trust funds, she added dryly. His jaw tightened. I don't expect you to understand the dynamics of the Astor family. And I don't expect you to understand basic human connection, Claire shot back, which should make this whole united front thing a blast. They stared at each other across the vast, echoing space of the living room. Sleek furniture, too much marble, and just enough distance to make silence feel like war. Then Julian exhaled. This isn't productive, he said finally. We have 363 days remaining. Perhaps it would be wise to establish some ground rules. Make cohabitation less combative. The suggestion surprised her. It was too rational, too unguarded to be a performance. She nodded. That's reasonable. Without a word, Julian crossed the room, pulled open a drawer, and retrieved a leather-bound notebook. He flipped it to a blank page and picked up a pen. Claire blinked again. You still use paper? He didn't look up. Some things deserve to be written down. He clicked the pen. Rule 1. Private spaces are sacred. Your bedroom, my bedroom. No entry without permission. Agreed, she said, sliding onto the stool across from him at the kitchen island. Rule 2. Shared spaces are neutral territory. No passive-aggressive rearranging of the other's things. Julian glanced up, as if daring her. I don't do passive-aggressive, he said. Just aggressive. Efficient, she corrected with a smirk. He wrote it down anyway. Rule 3. No surprise appearances. If we're expected to smile at an opera or gala, the other gets advance notice. Claire nodded. Rule 4. We maintain separate lives, but agree to attend necessary events together. For optics. They continued like that carefully, methodically dividing up their existence like diplomats carving up a disputed border. By the time they finished, the list spanned 3 pages and included everything from shared calendar permissions to bathroom schedules and TV remote protocol. It wasn't love. It wasn't trust. But it was a beginning, of something. Not a marriage, but maybe a ceasefire. And in a home built on cold surfaces and signed agreements, that was no small thing. Media statements check. Public behavior check. Julian said, reviewing their newly written marriage constitution with the satisfaction of a man who just brought order to chaos. Physical contact in public hand-holding, acceptable. Kissing case by case. Almost covers it, Claire said, then tapped her finger lightly on the edge of the page. One more. Julian raised an eyebrow. Honesty, she said simply. If this arrangement becomes unworkable for either of us, we don't scheme or run to our fathers. No PR spins, no legal maneuvering. We talk. Directly. Julian studied her for a moment, her expression calm but firm. He didn't reply right away. Then slowly, he nodded. Agreed, he said, and added the line to the bottom of the list with a slow, deliberate stroke. Though I should warn you, brutal honesty is something of an Astor family trait. I've noticed, Claire said, dry as sea salt, and I should warn you, unshakable integrity runs deep in the Whitmore bloodline. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Well then, we're perfectly mismatched. The moment hung there between them, a Whitmore-age warmth neither of them expected. Not chemistry, not yet, but something not unkind. Claire cleared her throat and stood. I should unpack. First day tomorrow. Ah, yes, Julian said. Your wedding present. From dear old Dad, a corner office at Astor Holdings, and a team of 6 to bring your sustainability protocols to life. Don't make it sound like nepotism, Claire warned. Those protocols are based on 3 years of research, reviewed and approved by top scientists in the field. Julian held up his hands, mock innocent. Never said they weren't brilliant, just pointing out that most brides get blenders and bath towels. Despite herself, Claire laughed. And what did you get out of all this? She asked, still smiling. Aside from uninterrupted access to your trust fund? Julian's expression shifted humor, giving way to something quieter, more introspective. A year, he said. A reprieve. Time to prove to my father and maybe to myself that I'm more than just the headline caricature. More than the arrogant heir in a viral video. The answer surprised her. It felt real. And can you? She asked gently. Julian looked at her for a moment, then shrugged. I guess we'll find out. The brief flicker of vulnerability disappeared behind his polished mask. But it had been there, and Claire had seen it. That night, Claire lay in her new room, once Julian's home office, now hastily converted into a guest bedroom with an air mattress and her bedding from Brooklyn. Her suitcase leaned against the wall. Her laptop sat on a sleek white desk. It was functional, if not welcoming. Through the wall, she could hear the muted rhythms of his life, the shower running, drawers opening and closing, the low murmur of his voice on a call. It was Whitmore how intimate those sounds felt, how quickly her life had become tangled with his. For the next year, they would share mornings, evenings, family obligations, and finely tuned performances. They were legal partners, contractual allies, Whitmorgers, bound together by necessity, and, perhaps, something else they hadn't yet named. In the next room, Julian sat at his desk, scrolling through late-night emails. The penthouse, once cold and curated, suddenly felt both too large and far too small. Claire had only moved in that morning, but already her presence had shifted something. A worn paperback on the coffee table, a hand-knit throw tossed over the back of the couch, a pair of wildly impractical, brightly colored slippers by the door, evidence of actual living. He stared at the slippers for a long moment, and the so Whitmore jest thing was he didn't hate it. The next morning brought their first test in real cohabitation, two people sharing a kitchen, juggling routines in a space that had only ever belonged to one of them. They moved like Switmorgers, trying not to crash into each other, reaching for mugs, passing utensils, bumping elbows at the coffee machine. "You don't have any real food," Claire said, peering into the sleek, mostly empty fridge. Julian glanced over the top of his coffee mug. "I have 12 varieties of sparkling water, imported jam, and something that claims to be yogurt, but may be a science experiment." "I usually eat at the office," Julian said, straightening his tie with practiced ease. "The executive dining room has a chef who trained in Paris." "Of course it does," Claire muttered, settling for a designer yogurt from the nearly empty fridge, a container that probably cost more than her entire weekly grocery run back in Brooklyn. They descended in the private elevator in companionable silence, the kind that no longer felt forced. Both dressed impeccably for the day ahead, Julian in a sharply tailored Tom Ford suit, Claire in a crisp slate blue pantsuit, professional, stylish, and just distinctive enough to be noticed. It wasn't until they reached the marble lobby that Julian, without looking at her, quietly extended his arm. "We're in public now," he reminded her. "Mr. and Mrs. Astor. Madly in love." Claire hesitated only a second before slipping her hand into the crook of his elbow. "Try not to look like you're enduring dental surgery," she murmured. "We'll blow our cover before we reach the curb." Julian's expression barely shifted, but his signature public smile slipped into place, flawless and disarming. "Better?" "Marginally," Claire replied, returning the smile with her own, practiced, polished, and just real enough to make people wonder. Outside, the morning sunlight glinted off steel and glass, Manhattan already pulsing with its daily rhythm. Two sleek black cars waited at the curb. "Your chariot," Julian said, gesturing to the second vehicle. "I took the liberty of arranging it. Your department is based in the Madison Avenue building, not the main tower." Claire blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected thoughtfulness. "Thank you." "Don't look so surprised," he said with a smirk. "I am capable of basic decency. Let's say the evidence has been inconsistent." But her tone lacked bite, and he noticed. For a second, they stood there on the sidewalk, caught in a quiet pause. Neither one rushed to fill. Around them, the city roared forward, but in their little pocket of space, something softened. "Have a good day at the office, dear," Julian said, letting the domestic cliché roll off his tongue with playful warmth. Claire, surprising them both, rose on her toes and pressed a light kiss to his cheek. "For the cameras," she said smoothly. "Of course." "Of course," he echoed. "Don't collapse the global economy before dinner." He laughed, low and genuine. And then they stepped into their separate cars, their separate lives, each feeling the Switmorage, weighty echo of the arrangement settle a little more firmly on their shoulders. The game had begun in earnest, and neither of them was sure what the rules were anymore. 3 months later, the Astor Industries annual holiday gala glowed in the soft amber light of the ballroom, all crystal chandeliers and murmured negotiations. Claire stood near the edge of the crowd, watching Julian as he moved through the room with the ease of someone who had learned, finally, how to stop pretending and start playing the part. His smile was effortless, but no longer empty. His conversations were sharp, but not cold. He listened. He asked questions, and he looked, dare she admit it, like someone who belonged in this world. He's gotten good at this, came Victoria's voice at her side, along with the quiet clink of two champagne flutes. She handed one to Claire. Claire accepted it with a nod of thanks. She and Victoria had developed a surprising rapport in recent weeks, forged through shared sarcasm and an unspoken understanding of what it meant to survive in the Astor family orbit. Last year, Victoria added, he vanished to the executive lounge 40 minutes into the event, said the room was giving him hives. Claire's gaze flicked back to Julian. The board looks pleased. They're shocked, Victoria corrected, taking a sip. The consensus was that marriage would either destroy him or do absolutely nothing. No one expected this. This was Julian Astor 2.0, still polished, still armed with his signature smirk, but different, present, sharp in all the right ways, and increasingly respected within the company. In the 12 weeks since the wedding, he had shown up to work before 8 a.m. every day. And more importantly, he'd stayed. In just 3 months, Julian had done more than most thought possible. He'd led the acquisition of 2 promising clean energy startups, streamlined international compliance across Astor's Asia-Pacific holdings, and most surprisingly, personally championed the sustainability protocols Claire had spent years developing. I'd love to take credit for the Whitmore's formation, Claire said dryly, watching him from across the ballroom. But I think your father's ultimatum did most of the work. Victoria sipped her champagne, eyes sharp above the rim. Don't sell yourself short. Max has been living under ultimatums his entire life. None of them ever stuck until now. Claire didn't get the chance to respond. Julian appeared at her side, his bow tie now slightly loosened, his posture just relaxed enough that someone who lived with him, really lived with him, would recognize it as relief. The Robinson Group's in, he said, directing it toward Victoria. She raised an eyebrow. Thomas Robinson? He's been fighting environmental regulations since the Nixon era. Julian smirked. Let's just say I made a very persuasive case for the financial upside of going green. There was satisfaction in his voice, but also a kind of excitement Claire had started to recognize. This wasn't just him doing damage control. He cared. He might never admit it out loud, but she saw it now, especially in moments like this. That's the 3rd major holdout this month, she said, blinking at him. You're actually converting people. Julian turned toward her, his gaze catching hers with a flicker of challenge. Don't sound so surprised, Mrs. Astor. Some of us are capable of evolution. The use of her married name was technically for show another detail of their public act, but something about the way he said it tonight made it feel different. Not performative, not cold, almost intimate. A shared joke. Their dynamic had shifted. The carefully drawn boundaries that once kept them distant had blurred slowly, subtly. They still had their own rooms, still lived largely separate lives, but somewhere along the way, the shared space had become theirs. Julian didn't disappear the moment he walked through the door anymore. Claire no longer treated the penthouse like enemy territory. Your father's watching, Victoria murmured, subtly tilting her head toward the other side of the ballroom. Harold Astor was indeed watching, eyes assessing, expression unreadable. Julian sighed. We should give him something to talk about. He stepped slightly closer, his hand sliding to the small of Claire's back with practiced, almost affectionate ease. Subtle, she warned, though she leaned into his touch, as naturally as if it had always belonged there. Nothing that'll end up in the society pages. You underestimate how dull the society pages have become, Victoria said breezily. Unless you're planning to recreate that slap from the gala, you won't make the front page. That feels like a lifetime ago, Claire said softly. And it did. The memory was still vivid, but no longer raw, almost warm now, like the beginning of something neither of them had expected. Only 9 months left, Julian murmured, voice low, meant only for her. Then you can slap me again, contract free. Something about the reminder about the expiration date hanging invisibly above their heads sent an unexpected twinge through her chest. I'll mark my calendar, she replied lightly, brushing the feeling aside. The orchestra began a waltz. The lights dimmed just slightly. Julian extended a hand, offering it with a slight, theatrical bow. Dance with me? For appearances, of course. Of course, she echoed, placing her hand in his. They moved onto the dance floor, stepping into rhythm with an ease born from repetition. Julian was a surprisingly graceful dancer, yet another skill drilled into him by years of high society expectation, and Claire had grown into his lead without even realizing it. There was a report, she said softly, as they turned in synchrony beneath the chandeliers. Compliance Division just submitted their quarterly update. They moved in graceful circles among the other couples, their steps practiced, fluid and unspoken language written into each pivot and turn. Emissions are down, Claire said quietly, 177% across all domestic holdings. I saw the report, Julian replied, steering them through the next movement. It's impressive work. The board's starting to take notice, she added, her voice touched with cautious surprise. Your father even stopped by my office today. Offered congratulations. Julian raised an eyebrow. The great Harold Astor made a personal appearance? Next you'll tell me he smiled. Not quite, Claire said, with a small laugh. More like a slightly less judgmental frown. Julian chuckled, a sound so warm and genuine it still caught her by surprise, even after all these months. That's practically effusive for him. You should be honored. I think he's more impressed with you, Claire admitted. The way you've repositioned the sustainability work as a market advantage, it's smart. It wasn't what anyone expected. Julian's expression shifted, something thoughtful passing through it. Would it surprise you to know, he said, his voice quieter now, that I actually believe in what you're doing? Not just as good optics, but as the right direction for the company? It did surprise her, but as she looked at him, at the man who had once treated her like a footnote, perhaps it shouldn't have, over the months, she'd seen sparks of something real behind his public persona. A fire, a conviction, especially when he talked about Blackwood Industries and the future it could shape. You never mentioned that, she said, when we argued about fossil fuel divestment. Julian arched an eyebrow. Those weren't arguments. They were strategic discussions. With raised voices and wine stains on the marble, she added dryly. I never disagreed with your goal, he said. Only your timeline. 5 years is the compromise, Claire countered, slipping into their familiar rhythm. 10 is realistic, Julian returned. Unless you want to collapse half the Southeast Asian economy overnight. The planet doesn't have 10 years. And the company won't have 5 if we go bankrupt before finishing the Whitmore scission. They'd had versions of this debate dozens of times over dinner, in the car, sometimes half asleep across coffee mugs. What began as heated sparring had slowly evolved into something more thoughtful, more collaborative. Each had begun to bend, just slightly, toward the other. We'll revisit the timeline in 2 years, Claire said at last. Once the markets stabilize? Reasonable, Julian agreed, his hand resting lightly at her waist as they turned. See? We've become civil, almost like a real married couple. The words hovered between them, half joke, half truth. Their relationship had been forged from paper and pressure, but over time it had grown roots. Not in romance, but in mutual respect, in partnership, in learning how to move through the world in step with someone who didn't look or think like you, and finding strength in that difference. As the music slowed, Julian brought her hand to his lips. It wasn't part of their usual performance, and it wasn't for anyone else. Thank you, he said quietly. For what? For making this year far less torturous than I expected. His tone was casual, but his eyes held something else, something earnest. Claire felt the flutter before she could stop it. The bar was low, she said, smiling despite herself. And yet, Julian replied, you've been extraordinary. Before she could answer, a familiar voice interrupted. May I steal my daughter for a moment? James Whitmore approached, a glass of champagne in hand, his expression pleasantly unreadable. Julian released her with a polite nod. Of course, he said smoothly. I should check in on the Robinson deal anyway. As Julian moved away, James studied Claire with eyes that missed nothing. You two have become quite convincing. That was the goal, Claire replied evenly. Indeed, he said, then paused. Though I wonder if the performance hasn't begun to blur with the truth. She took a long, measured sip of champagne before answering. We've found it's a functional working relationship, Claire said carefully, her voice even, if that's what you're asking. Her father gave her a knowing smile. That kind of clarity does make the arrangement easier to maintain. She nodded, but James wasn't finished. Is that all it is? He asked, voice light, eyes sharp. Claire felt her posture tighten. What else would it be? I don't know, James replied mildly. You tell me. He didn't push. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. I've known you your whole life, he said, and I've never seen you look at anyone the way you look at him. When you think no one's watching. Heat crept up Claire's neck, her composure slipping. You're misreading the situation, am I? He didn't press further, just gave a small, almost fatherly smile. Contracts, he said, can be renegotiated if circumstances change. Before Claire could respond, he turned to greet a business associate, leaving her in the wake of his words, unsettled, and perhaps a little exposed. That night, the ride home was quiet, but not awkward. A soft, companionable silence settled between them in the back seat of the town car, the city blurring past beyond the tinted windows. Claire glanced sideways. Julian sat beside her, his bow tie undone, collar open. His posture, always so meticulous in public, had melted into something more natural. He was scrolling through emails, brows faintly furrowed in concentration. His phone cast a gentle glow across his face, sharp cheekbones, tired eyes, a quiet focus she now found familiar. She'd come to know his rhythms, the way he drank his morning coffee black, in the same chipped blue mug, how he left handwritten notes on the kitchen counter instead of texting when he left early, how he hummed barely recognizable jazz tunes when he thought she was out of earshot. When had she started noticing all these things? More importantly, when had she started missing them when he wasn't there? You're staring, Julian said without looking up. Do I have something on my face? Just thinking, she replied, quickly glancing away. Dangerous pastime, he said, a smile tugging at one corner of his mouth. Anything in particular? Claire hesitated, then chose truth. My father thinks we're getting too good at this. That made him pause. He looked up, locking eyes with her. Too good for whom? For us, she said quietly. He didn't reply right away. His face, half shadowed by passing streetlights, revealed nothing. And what do you think? The car rolled to a stop outside their building before she could answer. The doorman was already opening the door. The moment dissolved as they slipped back into roles. Julian's hand touched the small of her back, gentle, familiar as they walked past the concierge and into the private elevator. Neither spoke until the door closed behind them in the penthouse. The ritual resumed, shoes off, coats hung, a quiet shifting into something more real. Julian poured them both a nightcap scotch for him, amaretto for her, another rhythm, another thread that had woven itself into their lives. He handed her the glass, then asked softly, but without detour, "You never answered my question." Claire took a slow sip, bought herself another breath. "I think boundaries blur," she said at last, "when you spend this much time pretending." Julian's eyes didn't leave her. "Is that what we're doing?" His voice was quieter now, less certain. Pretending. The question hung there between them, fragile and suspended. The contract had been clear. 1 year. No feelings, no entanglements. And yet, "I don't know anymore," she admitted. The truth felt terrifying, but also freeing. Julian set down his glass, took a step forward, then another. He was standing directly in front of her now. "What if," he said gently, "we weren't pretending?" Claire looked up at him, and for a moment really saw him. Not the billionaire, not the carefully composed heir, but the man who had shown up every day, who had grown, listened, changed. The man who had surprised her over and over again, stubborn, brilliant, unexpectedly principled, and far more dangerous to her heart than she'd ever imagined. "Probably," Claire whispered. But she didn't step away. Not when Julian reached up to tuck a Whitmore of hair behind her ear, his fingers grazing her jaw with a touch so careful it felt like a question. "We've always been good at navigating disasters," he murmured, his hand lingering. "It's basically our brand now." The humor cracked something open, and despite the wild flutter in her chest, Claire smiled. "True," she said. "We started with a slap and a viral headline. Everything after that's been oddly tame." Julian's thumb moved gently along her cheekbone, and the touch so different from their staged interactions felt impossibly real. "Can I try something?" he said softly, off script. Claire didn't need clarification. She knew exactly what he meant, knew that if she said yes, there would be no going back, that this, whatever this was, would unravel everything they'd kept neatly compartmentalized for months. The smart answer was no. "Yes," she said instead. The kiss that followed bore no resemblance to the one they'd shared at their wedding. There was no audience, no cameras, no expectation. Only quiet, cautious curiosity. A shared breath, a leap into the unfamiliar. His lips were soft, patient, almost hesitant, asking, not taking, giving her every chance to pull away. But she didn't. Instead, her hands found his shoulders, then his neck, her fingers slipping into his hair as the kiss deepened, tentative wonder becoming undeniable truth. A slow, steady collision of all the moments that had led them here. They didn't rush, didn't pretend, didn't need to. When they finally broke apart, Both slightly breathless, Julian rested his forehead against hers. "That was definitely not in the contract," he murmured. "Technically," Claire said, her voice a little uneven, "the contract doesn't prohibit this. It only defines the duration of the marriage, not the nature of it." Julian let out a soft laugh. "Leave it to the lawyer to find the loophole." "It's not a loophole," she replied, her fingers still gently resting at the back of his neck. "It's an omission, maybe a deliberate one." He pulled back just enough to look at her. Really look at her. "So where does that leave us?" he asked, voice quieter now. There was no mask in his expression, no practiced charm, just him unguarded. Claire didn't answer right away. "Right where we are," she said finally. "Married, for another 9 months, figuring it out." She studied his face, her tone steady. "Unless you'd rather go back to the way things were." Julian didn't answer with words. He kissed her again, this time with more certainty, more intention. It was an answer wrapped in warmth, in promise. And when they pulled apart, his voice was gentle. "I think it's safe to say the original arrangement has been officially renegotiated." "Should we draft new terms?" she asked, half teasing. "Maybe," he said, "after we sleep on it." Despite the way his hand still rested at her waist, neither moved. Claire raised an eyebrow. Separately, she added, catching the question in his eyes before he could ask. "One revelation per night is enough." Julian sighed, stepping back with reluctance. Reasonable amendment. "We've always been great at delayed gratification." She laughed, the sound breaking the tension like sunlight. "Speak for yourself. I'm terrible at waiting." "Something for me to look forward to, then," he replied, with a smile that shimmered with both humor and hope. They parted at the hallway. He turning right, she left back to the bedrooms that had once been symbolic of their distance. But as they walked away, both knew something had changed. Not in the paperwork, not in the plan. In them. The carefully constructed act had cracked wide open. And something rawer, deeper, infinitely more real had started to grow in its place. Claire closed her bedroom door behind her and leaned against it, breath catching in her chest. Her heart was pounding with exhilaration and fear. Because this hadn't been part of the plan, falling for her contractually obligated husband had never been part of the plan. It hadn't been on any of her spreadsheets, not in the color-coded folders, not in the carefully organized files Olivia had created when this marriage began. But here she was, heart-thudding, mind restless, navigating a feeling too big for any column or calculated plan. Across the penthouse, Julian sat on the edge of his bed, fingers resting lightly against his lips. The sensation of her kiss still lingered soft, surprising, unforgettable. The woman who had once slapped him across the face had somehow become the person he looked forward to seeing last at night and first in the morning. The one he wanted to make laugh. The one he caught himself watching just to hear her thoughts on the world. Her presence had moved from inconvenience to need without him even noticing. Neither of them slept much that night, too aware of the calendar, too aware of what came next. The contract would end at midnight, and what came after was no longer written. "You're going to wear a hole in the carpet." Julian looked up, startled. Victoria stood in the doorway of his office, arms folded, a flicker of amusement in her eyes. He hadn't heard her come in. Too lost in his thoughts, his pacing rhythmic and increasingly frantic. "I'm thinking," he said defensively, clearly, she replied, stepping inside. Loudly enough that your assistant called me because she's convinced you're having a meltdown. He glanced through the glass wall. His assistant, usually composed, was now staring a little too intently at her monitor. I'm fine, he insisted, smoothing down his already immaculate tie. Just processing some metrics for the quarterly report. The report, Victoria said, sliding into the chair opposite his desk. That was finalized last week? The one that showed record growth, including a 23% increase in the sustainability portfolio you used to mock. Julian sighed and sat down heavily. If I lie, he said, you'll know. Obviously. He hesitated. It's our anniversary. Understanding flickered instantly across Victoria's face. Ah, that deadline. Julian nodded. Midnight tonight. The contract ends. She tilted her head. And? He rubbed the back of his neck, an anxious habit he hadn't indulged in for years. I don't want it to. Victoria didn't react with surprise. In fact, she looked suspiciously like she was trying not to smile. So, she said slowly, you've finally come to terms with the fact that you're in love with your wife. I didn't say that. You didn't need to. Julian stood again, resuming his slow pacing. That's the problem, he muttered. We haven't talked about it. Not really. Not about what happens after. Things have been good, better than good, but we've both avoided the question. The truth sat heavy in his chest. Over the past 6 months, their once meticulous boundaries had all but disappeared. The spare bedroom had been vacated by February. Their morning routines had merged without planning, Julian making coffee while Olivia assembled breakfast. Their conversations drifting from policy to art to dry, comfortable silence. Evenings were no longer filled with careful distance. They debated films, swapped case studies and financial forecasts. Sometimes they simply coexisted, him reviewing proposals, her curled up nearby with a book. It wasn't romance, not exactly. It was something better. It was ease. It was partnership. It was home. And now the contract, the thing that had started it all, was about to dissolve. Julian wasn't sure what scared him more, losing her or admitting he wanted to keep her. They were partners in every way that mattered. At Blackwood Industries, Julian and Claire had become a unified force, his strategic finesse paired with her unshakable principles. Together, they had reshaped an empire. Personally, professionally, even intimately. They had blurred the lines, all except one. Legally, the terms had never changed. 1 year, then dissolution. So ask her, Victoria said, as if it were the easiest thing in the world. Julian ran a hand through his hair. It's not that simple. Why not? Because the entire premise of this, of us, was that it had an end date, he replied, gesturing vaguely, helplessly, to the space around him. What if she's just been enduring it, counting down the days? What if all of this has just been a very polished, very polite version of making the best of a bad situation? Victoria's expression softened, and for once, she didn't tease. I've seen the way she looks at you, she said quietly, and the way you look at her. You didn't build this just to let it disappear. But what if I'm wrong? Julian whispered, the words falling from him like confession. What if I tell her I want more and she feels obligated because of the company, the partnerships, the public expectations? The mighty Julian Astor, Victoria murmured, brought to his knees by the fear of rejection. Didn't think I'd ever see the day. Not helpful. Actually, she said, standing, it is, because it means this matters to you. She crossed to the doorway, then turned back with rare, sincere warmth in her voice. A year ago, you wouldn't have cared enough about anyone's feelings to pace holes in your office rug. You've changed. She's changed you. Julian stared down at the floor, quiet. The deadline loomed like a finish line, but all he wanted now was to reroute the race. You need to talk to her, Victoria continued, before that contract expires. And say what, exactly? The truth, she replied simply. That somewhere between that slap in Manhattan and now, you fell in love with your wife. The word hit him like a tidal wave. Wife. Love. He had avoided those words for months, wrapped them in safer phrases like deep respect and growing admiration. Words that couldn't wound, couldn't expose. But Victoria had just named it, and it fit. I've never said that, Julian murmured, not to anyone. Then it's about time you started, she said, stepping through the door. Preferably before midnight. She paused at the threshold and turned one last time. For what it's worth, you two are better together than either of you are on your own. And I should know I've had front row seats to this entire production. And with that, she was gone, leaving him alone with the truth he could no longer deny. He was in love with Olivia Whitmore Astor, and in just under 14 hours, he would have no legal claim to her at all. Across the city, in the newly renamed Blackwood Environmental Initiatives, now a fully independent branch under the corporate umbrella, Olivia was having a similarly restless day. You've read the same paragraph 4 times, said Mei Lin, Olivia's research director and closest confidant. She leaned casually against Olivia's desk, one eyebrow raised. Either that sustainability report is Shakespeare, or something someone has you completely distracted. Olivia blinked down at her tablet, realizing that the text had stopped making sense an hour ago. I'm just preoccupied. May said, not buying it for a second. Would this preoccupation happen to be approximately 6 feet tall, unfairly attractive, and legally your husband? For she checked her watch with exaggerated flair. About 13 more hours. Olivia's head snapped up. How do you know that? Please, May said with a grin. Everyone knows, or at least anyone who was here when you started. The boss's marriage contract was practically legend around here. Olivia groaned, setting the tablet aside. Of course it was. May's tone softened. So, are you counting down the hours, or hoping they never run out? Olivia didn't answer right away, because she didn't know. Not exactly. All she knew was that the thought of waking up tomorrow in a world where Julian was no longer part of her every day, his coffee waiting on the counter, his sarcastic commentary on market trends, the way he watched her when he thought she wasn't looking, made her feel like the floor had dropped out from beneath her, and she wasn't sure if she'd ever recover from that kind of fall. The CEO's son, but only for a year. That was literally part of my orientation gossip, May said, smirking from her perch on Olivia's desk. She studied Olivia's face more closely, her teasing fading into concern. The real question, she added, is why you look like someone canceled Christmas when you should be celebrating your big break. I'm not, Olivia began, then trailed off. The denial felt hollow, even to her own ears, because the truth was simple and terrifying. She wasn't relieved the contract was ending. She wasn't ready for this to be over. She'd been dreading it for months. What had once felt like a countdown to freedom now ticked like a fuse toward something unbearable loss. May's expression gentled. You don't want it to end, she said, not a question, but a truth stated with quiet clarity. Olivia pushed away from her desk and walked toward the wide windows overlooking Madison Avenue, her arms folded tightly across her chest. It's complicated. No, it really isn't, May replied. You love him. Olivia didn't respond. Based on how he looks at you every time he stops by, which, by the way, is suspiciously often for someone with zero operational ties to this office, I'd say the feeling's mutual. We never planned for this, Olivia said softly. The whole arrangement was built on an expiration date. It wasn't supposed to mean anything. Plans change, May said with a shrug. People do too. You certainly changed him. She wasn't wrong. The man who had once strutted into meetings with smirking detachment now brought her coffee in the mornings, stayed late to prep for sustainability reviews, and asked hard questions not to tear things down, but to build them better. He hadn't become someone else. He'd become the best version of himself. The sharp intellect that once only cut was now focused on innovation. The restless charm that once drained into galas and gossip was now driving real reform. He was still Julian Astor, brilliant, intense, occasionally impossible, but now he was also something else grounded, purposeful, hers, and she had changed too. What once was fierce idealism had matured into something more effective strategy. She'd learned to work within systems she once despised, to Whitmore's form them from the inside, and that growth had come not in spite of Julian, but because of him. They had reshaped each other. I don't even know how I'd bring it up, Olivia murmured, turning back to May. What do I say? Remember that fake marriage we both signed up for? I want to renew it forever. May grinned. You're both business people. Propose a new contract, one without an expiration date. The suggestion hit Olivia like a spark to dry kindling. Of course. It was absurd, romantic, and perfectly in character for them. You're a genius, she said, already reaching for her phone. I know, May said, cheerful. That's why you pay me. She stepped off the desk. Now go. Whatever grand gesture you're mentally blueprinting, I'll cover your meetings. Across the city, another plan was unfolding. By 7:00 p.m., Julian had secured a private dining room at Le Bernardin, the very place where their first public family dinner had taken place. He'd spent the day orchestrating every detail, checking and rechecking it against the mental checklist that had formed the moment he realized he wanted to fight for her. The staff had been briefed. The candles were lit. The flowers were simple, elegant gardenias, her favorite. A quiet instrumental version of At Last played in the background, barely audible. And in the pocket of his perfectly tailored jacket was a ring. Not a new one, but the ring, the emerald and diamond heirloom from his grandmother. The one Olivia had worn when they first walked into this Whitmore arrangement pretending to be a couple. He hadn't asked for another. He didn't need to. Because what he was about to offer wasn't a new beginning. It was a continuation of the life they'd already begun to build without even realizing it. The emerald ring, once meant as a mere prop in their carefully staged marriage, had remained unworn because somewhere along the way, neither of them needed props to convince the world or themselves of the connection they now shared. Across town, Olivia stood in their penthouse, placing the final touches on her own plan. A new contract lay on the kitchen island, printed on the same luxurious cardstock as the original agreement, but this one was very different. No end dates, no performance clauses, just a simple title at the top: proposal for a permanent partnership. Next to it sat a small, deep blue box. Inside was a watch she'd had custom made for Julian. Elegant, understated. Engraved on the back were the coordinates of the Plaza Hotel ballroom, the precise spot where she had slapped him 1 year and 3 months ago. The place where it had all begun. At exactly 8 p.m., both of their phones chimed simultaneously. Julian's message was brief. Something came up at the office. Rain check on dinner? Meet me at home instead. Olivia's was similar, but the opposite, running late. Push dinner to 9:30. Meet you at the restaurant. They stared at their screens, frowning, confusion overtaking excitement. Then a second chime. This time, the messages bore familiar names. From Harold Astor's son, I'd like to discuss the future of the Astor-Whitmore partnership. Suite 1542, Pelham Hotel. 8:30 sharp. From James Whitmore, daughter. Urgent matters regarding Blackwood environmental initiatives. Pelham Hotel. Suite 542. 8:30 tonight. Suspicion. Then resignation. Then shared resolve. They'd been played. Again. But this time, it was different. Years of conditioning and a genuine respect for the empire they had built together meant neither of them could easily ignore the summons. They would go. Not out of obedience, but out of care. The legacy they were shaping together deserved that. At 8:28, Julian arrived at Suite 1542, the ring still safely in his pocket. His dinner reservation had been postponed, but not canceled, not in his heart. 1 floor below, Olivia stepped off the elevator, the new contract and watch box tucked inside her purse. Her expression was diplomatic calm. Her frustration sat just beneath it, quiet but determined. They spotted each other at the same moment. Their faces broke into matching expressions of confusion, then dawning realization. "What are you doing here?" they asked in unison. "My father called a meeting," they replied. Again, in perfect synchronicity. Silence, then shared laughter. "Then we've been played," Julian said, his voice dry but amused. Again, Olivia sighed, a reluctant smile tugging at her lips. "You'd think we'd learn." The door to Suite 1542 opened before they could decide on their next move. A hotel staff member greeted them with a practiced smile. "Mr. and Mrs. Astor," he said with a slight bow. "Your table is ready." They exchanged a bemused glance, then followed him inside. The suite had been Whitmore's formed. A single table sat in the center of the room, surrounded by soft blue hydrangeas, the same flowers from their wedding ceremony. Candles flickered, casting a golden glow over silverware and crystal glasses. A bottle of champagne chilled nearby. Soft jazz drifted from hidden speakers, like a memory returning. "Your father's arranged everything," the attendant explained, holding out Olivia's chair. "They send their regrets that they couldn't attend, but felt you might appreciate the privacy." He gestured toward a small call button on the table. "Dinner will be served whenever you're ready. Simply press this." With another polite bow, he stepped out and closed the door behind them, leaving Julian and Olivia alone in the warm silence of the room. A room filled not with expectations, but with invitation. They looked at each other. No pretense, no scripts, just two people who had once been S. Whitmorgers, now standing on the edge of something real and entirely their own. They sat across the table, eyes searching, hearts racing, both silently adjusting to the reality that this moment so carefully orchestrated by others had somehow aligned perfectly with the plans they had each made in secret. "So," Julian began, his usual composure faltering slightly, "it seems our fathers are still meddling. Olivia's fingers absently traced the stem of her water glass. Some things never change, she agreed softly, then added with the faintest smile, although I have to admit, this is a much more elegant manipulation than their last attempt. Julian let out a low laugh, the sound easing the tension between them. The bar was admittedly low. Forced matrimony isn't exactly a subtle tactic in parental power plays, and yet, Olivia glanced around the candlelit suite. Here we are. The words settled between them, like silk simple, but weighted with everything they'd walked through to get here. No longer enemies, no longer reluctant partners, but something far deeper. Olivia, Julian said, then paused, an unfamiliar uncertainty flickering in his voice. There's something I've been meaning to talk to you about today, about what it means. Me too, Olivia said quietly, meeting his eyes. I've been thinking about it for weeks. You have? Julian blinked, surprised, then, cautiously, hopefully, of course. It's not exactly a date you forget. The end of our contract. He studied her face, searching for any sign of her feelings. And how do you feel about that? The expiration? Olivia drew in a steady breath. It was time to stop holding back. I think, she said carefully, we need a new contract. For a second, Julian's expression shifted, something like disappointment flashing in his eyes before he masked it, retreating into familiar poise. I see, he said, with different terms, I assume. Very different, Olivia replied. She reached into her purse and drew out a folder, placing it gently between them on the table. Julian's gaze dropped to the title, embossed in elegant script, Marriage Agreement, Permanent Terms. He looked up, blinking, startled. Not a single polished response came to him, only genuine, quiet wonder. Permanent? If you're willing, Olivia said. Her voice was calm, but her heart thundered. I found the current arrangement unexpectedly satisfying. A smile spread across Julian's face, not the one he wore for cameras or boardrooms, but the one Olivia had come to know and cherish. The smile reserved only for her. Surprisingly satisfactory, he repeated, with a soft chuckle. You really know how to flatter a man, Mrs. Astor. I'm still working on my romantic vocabulary, she admitted, her own smile widening, but I'm committed to improving. Indefinitely. Julian reached across the table and took her hand, his thumb brushing slow, steady circles across her knuckles. Coincidentally, he murmured, I've been working on a proposal of my own. He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket and placed it beside the contract. Olivia recognized it instantly. The heirloom ring. His grandmother's ring. The one they'd never used because it had always felt too real for what they were pretending to be. Her breath caught. Great minds indeed. She opened her purse once more and placed a small blue box next to the ring. Mine's a bit more horological, she said lightly. No legal terms, but I did include coordinates. Julian tilted his head. Coordinates? To the ballroom, she said, where I slapped you. I thought we should mark where it all began. He laughed, a warm, full sound that filled the space between them. We really are perfect for each other. Approaching even this from opposite but perfectly balanced angles, Olivia said, her voice soft with emotion. Balance in all things, Julian echoed. It's what makes us work. In business, in life, in everything. In everything, she agreed, fingers tightening gently around his. There were still no grand declarations, no dramatic speeches, just two people, in a quiet room filled with candlelight and memory, finally ready to begin the real thing. Not a contract, not a performance, just love. And this time, it was permanent. Julian's smile softened into something deeper as he opened the velvet box. The candlelight caught the emerald, casting a green flame across the table like a quiet kind of magic. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed everything he felt. "Claire Whitmore Astor," he said, "would you do me the honor of staying married to me? A beat. Then not for business, not for our families, but because somewhere between that slap and today, I fell completely in love with you." The words, so simple and sincere, unraveled whatever composure Claire had managed to hold. Tears welled in her eyes, not from surprise, but from the relief of finally hearing the thing they had both been circling for so long. "I would," she whispered, voice catching, "because somewhere on that same impossible journey, I fell in love with you too." Julian slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her all along. Claire opened her own box and gently turned the watch in her palm, showing him the back. An engraving, a date, coordinates, and a single line of text. Where it all began. Julian read it and laughed quietly. "The Plaza Ballroom. The exact spot where I publicly humiliated you," Claire said, stepping around the table. "And started the best year of my life," Julian replied, rising to meet her. One hand lifted to her cheek, slow, reverent, sure, the way he always touched her when he forgot the rest of the world existed. "I like those terms," he murmured. "Shall we seal the deal the traditional way?" "I think that's appropriate," she smiled, already rising on her toes. Their kiss was soft and sure, the kind that needed no witnesses, no stage. For the first time, they weren't proving anything to anyone. It was theirs, entirely. Just as their lips met, both their phones buzzed simultaneously. They paused, foreheads resting together, and glanced at the screens. "Congratulations on your first anniversary. The suite is yours for the weekend. No need to thank us." Harold and James Clare groaned, half laughing. They knew. Julian shook his head in amused disbelief. They planned this. Of course they did. "I should be furious," Julian said, pulling her into his arms. "But you're not. No, not even close." Claire's arms wound around his neck. "Let's never tell them it worked. Their egos can't take the validation." "Agreed," Julian said, his smile radiant, unguarded, real. "That can be our first official decision," he added, "as a voluntarily married couple." "The first of many," Claire promised, kissing him again, this time with laughter in her breath and love in her bones. 16 floors below, in the quiet hush of the hotel bar, two men sat nursing glasses of aged scotch. Harold Astor checked his watch as the hands ticked past midnight, the official end of the contract. The beginning of something far more valuable. "They'll be fine," James Whitmore said with a satisfied sip. Harold raised an eyebrow. "Should we tell them we installed cameras in the suite?" James's lips twitched with mischief. "I'm joking, Harold." Harold choked on his drink anyway. "Absolutely not." "That would be relax," James said, laughing at his co-conspirator's horror. Victoria confirmed they'd each made their own plans. "We just gave them a little nudge in the right direction." Harold nodded slowly. "Sometimes people need a push." He raised his glass. "To successful negotiations." James tapped his against it, and to love, he added his voice quieter, but no less sure. "Which, it turns out, is the best business strategy of all. They drank, satisfied, not just with a merger that had exceeded every projection, but with the unexpected miracle they had never dared to plan for two children who had learned, through the structure of a contract, how to build something far more enduring: a home, a partnership, and a love that required no expiration date. 16 floors above two smirking patriarchs clinking glasses over scotch, Claire and Julian Astor were far too wrapped in their own private celebration to spare a single thought for expiring contracts, parental manipulation, or the scheming that had brought them together in the first place. They had built something far more enduring than obligation, something that had begun with a slap, evolved through structure, and bloomed unexpectedly, irrevocably, into a love story neither of them could have written, but both now held closer than anything else in the world. Epilogue. 2 years later, the annual Astor Foundation Gala, now a joint venture with the Whitmore Foundation, glimmered beneath the chandeliers of the Plaza Ballroom. And as usual, Julian and Claire arrived fashionably late. Their fingers were laced together as they entered, the picture of effortless grace and quiet power. Together, they moved through the space with practiced ease, pausing just beside the spot where it all began. Julian leaned in, his voice brushing against her ear. "Any chance you feel the urge to slap me for old time's sake?" "Don't tempt me," Claire replied, adjusting the emerald ring on her finger, the same one he had given her. Again, the night they renewed their vows. "I'm trying to look civil. United front and all that." She reached down, her hand resting on the gentle curve of her stomach, still barely visible beneath the silk of her gown, but not so subtle that Julian didn't glance at it, with quiet awe every time he thought she wouldn't notice. It had become his new obsession. He'd already read 3 parenting books, 2 of them annotated, one Whitmore slated from French. "Have you told your father yet?" Julian asked, covering her hand with his. "I was saving it for tonight," Claire said with a smile. "Do you think he'll assume it was all part of some elaborate plan?" Without question, Julian laughed. But for once, we surprised ourselves without their interference. They made their way further into the crowd, greeted now not as curiosities or whispered about anomalies, but as Julian and Claire, partners in business, champions of reform, the couple whose improbable love story had become something of a legend among the city's elite, and more importantly, a love story they had chosen to live every single day. Later that evening, beneath the glittering chandeliers, they danced slowly. No cameras, no statements, no obligations. Just the two of them, swaying in the quiet kind of intimacy that came from knowing and choosing each other again and again. Claire rested her head against his shoulder, letting her eyes fall closed. "Who would have guessed," she murmured, "that the worst night of my professional life would lead to the best decision I never intended to make?" "I did," Julian said, his voice warm with amusement, his arms pulling her just a little closer. "The moment you slapped me, I knew." "Liar," Claire laughed. "You thought I was a radical with a trust fund and an attitude problem." "Well," he conceded, grinning, "that part wasn't wrong. But I was right about one thing." "Oh, you changed my life." The music swelled around them, familiar and soft. They danced not for strategy, not for optics, but because they wanted to, because even now, even after 2 years of partnership and power and parenting to be, this moment still felt extraordinary. And as they turned in slow, steady circles beneath the light, each thought the same quiet truth, that sometimes The most inconvenient beginnings, the most unwelcome arrangements, can become the most treasured choices when given time, when nurtured with honesty, and when led, finally, by the heart.